Deep beneath the cathedrals of Terra, below the vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, below even the sealed reliquaries of the Inquisition, there are doors no citizen is allowed to know exist. Doors without markings. Doors without prayers. Doors that are never opened twice in the same way. Behind them are not weapons meant for war, nor artifacts meant for reverence, but things so dangerous that even knowledge of their existence is treated as contamination. The Imperium calls these places black vaults, not because they are dark, but because nothing that enters them is ever meant to be illuminated again. Most horrors in the galaxy are destroyed. Xenos are purged. Heretics are burned. Demons are banished back into the warp. But some things cannot be killed without consequence. Some truths cannot be erased without destabilizing reality itself. When the Imperium encounters such threats, it does not fight them. It locks them away. It buries them beneath layers of adamantium, faith, secrecy, and silence, hoping that time itself will forget what was hidden. But vaults are not graves, and imprisonment is not the same as containment. Tonight, we descend into places Imperium refuses to name, and examine what happens when terror is preserved instead of destroyed. If you wish to explore the Imperium's forbidden depths and uncover the true seal behind doctrine and silence, then support this work by liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and share it with others who listen for echoes beneath the throne of history. Every act of support strengthens a signal against the darkness these vaults were built to hide. The first thing you learn when you are assigned beneath the palace is how to walk without leaving an impression. Footfalls echo differently down there. The stone is older than Terra's present shape, layered and relayered through 10,000 years of reconstruction, bombardment, and sanctification. Every corridor absorbs sound unevenly, as if listening. Those who patrol the Black Vault approaches are taught early to measure their steps, to let their presence register as routine rather than interruption. Routine is safety. Anything that feels noticed down here is already too close. I was not told the term Black Vault when my assignment began. No one is. The designation appears only in clearance matrices and encrypted routing glyphs, never spoken aloud. To those stationed above, we were custodian-adjacent auxiliaries, logistic shadows operating inside the palace's circulatory system. To those below, we were simply another layer of the lock. The access routes do not descend in straight lines. Elevators stop short of their advertised destinations. Stairwells curve where they should not, doubling back through older foundations that predate the palace entirely. Vox signals weaken, then vanish, not due to interference but deliberate architectural deadening. Even the air changes, filtered through systems that strip scent and particulate matter until everything smells faintly of cold metal and incense burned too long ago. The custodian guard does not stand watch everywhere. That is the first misconception most outsiders would make. The Adeptus Custodes are present at thresholds, at convergences, at places where decision still exists. The deeper vault corridors are maintained by others. Mechanicus ward teams, sanctioned no cadres, administratum scribes whose entire lives are spent updating records they are forbidden to read. We were part of that second category. Necessary, replaceable, intentionally ignorant. Every shift began with the same ritual. Identity confirmation, psychological baseline check, liturgical recitation not for faith, but calibration. The words mattered less than consistency. Deviations were logged. Deviations accumulated. Only then were routes assigned. No one walked the same path twice in a single cycle. Patterns invite familiarity. Familiarity invites curiosity. The routing cogitators ensured that no individual ever built a complete mental map of the lower vault network. You knew your corridor, your junctions, your seals. You did not know what lay beyond them. That knowledge belonged to no one person by design. The locks themselves were unimpressive at first glance. No Baroque ornamentation. No warning sigils beyond standard inquisitorial denial glyphs. Smooth black adamantium plates inset seamlessly into the stone, their surfaces absorbing light rather than reflecting it. They did not hum. They did not glow. They simply existed, patient and final. What unsettled most personnel was not the doors, but the space around them. The temperature dropped subtly within 10 meters of certain vault faces, regardless of surrounding systems. Auspex readings always returned with intolerance. and yet breath fog where it should not have. In other corridors, sound warped, footsteps arriving a fraction of a second late, as if the corridor itself needed time to decide whether to accept them. These effects were documented, categorized, and dismissed as residual ward bleed. We were instructed not to interpret. Maintenance was constant, not because the vaults were failing, but because they could not be allowed to age. Seals were refreshed daily, wards re-etched weekly. Mechanicus rites performed on schedules, so precise they bordered on obsessive. Not one of us believed these rituals strengthened the vaults in a mechanical sense. They strengthened us. Repetition builds confidence. Confidence keeps hands steady. The custodian presence made itself known only when necessary. When they appeared, it was never dramatic. No clatter of armor. No verbal command. One moment a corridor was empty. The next it was occupied by a figure whose presence compressed the space around it. Gold did not shine down here. It absorbed. Their helms never turned unnecessarily. If a custodian acknowledged you at all, it was with a single nod that carried more finality than any spoken order. They did not guard the vaults themselves. They guarded the idea that the vaults must never be opened. On one occasion, during a cycle that otherwise passed without incident, a Mechanicus ward adept faltered during recitation. A single syllable misplaced. The deviation was minor. The system flagged it anyway. The adept was removed quietly, escorted upward without explanation. His replacement arrived within the hour. No one asked where he went. That question would have been recorded. The true way of the Black Vaults was felt not during crisis, but during quiet, when no alarm sounded, when patrol routes blurred into habit, when you stood alone at a junction, watching lumen strips pulse at regulation intervals, and felt the persistent sense of being near something that did not want to be understood. The mind, deprived of explanation, fills the gap with instinct. Instinct down here always leaned toward restraint. There were no screams, no whispers, nothing dramatic enough to justify fear. And that was precisely the point. The Imperium does not lock away its most unholy terrors because they are loud. It locks them away because they are patient, because they endure, because some dangers grow worse when confronted and catastrophic when destroyed. Down here, beneath the throne, you learn the simple truth very quickly. The Black Vaults were not prisons built to hold monsters. They were structures designed to protect reality from certainty. Routine down there was not measured in hours, but in absences. Nothing happened, and that nothing was the point. The Black Vaults did not announce themselves through alarms or incursions. They exerted pressure in subtler ways, shaping behavior through unease rather than threat. You learn to slow your breathing without realizing why. You learn to avoid lingering at certain junctions, even when your route allowed it. You learn that curiosity was not punished immediately, but noted, cataloged, and quietly corrected. There were moments when the architecture itself felt instructional. Corridors narrowed just enough to discourage conversation. Ceiling heights shifted imperceptibly, compressing posture and thought alike. Even the lumen strips were calibrated to avoid shadows deep enough to invite speculation. Everything was engineered to produce the same psychological outcome: compliance through calm. Records maintenance was my secondary duty. Not the contents, never the contents, but the framework. Cross-checking seal integrity logs, ward cycle confirmations, access attempt null reports. Entire data slate stacks devoted confirming that nothing had changed. It was repetition elevated to doctrine, a reminder, repeated endlessly, that stability was achieved not by action, but by preventing it. Occasionally, a file would return an anomaly marker, not a breach, not an alert, just a notation indicating that a vault's internal readings had deviated within acceptable variance. These markers were routed upward immediately, encrypted and transmitted beyond our clearance. We were not meant to follow their resolution. The system did not trust interpretation at our level. What unsettled me most was how rarely those markers appeared. If the vaults held what rumors suggested they held, if even a fraction of the whispered possibilities were true, then the lack of fluctuation was unnatural. Nothing truly dangerous remains perfectly inert forever. Machines drift, wards decay, minds strain against confinement, and yet the readings held steady across centuries of maintenance logs. Either containment was flawless, or something inside had learned the value of stillness. You were not supposed to think like that. Sanctioned psychers were rotated through the deeper corridors on limited schedules, always escorted, always shielded. Their presence was clinical rather than investigative. They did not probe. They listened for resonance, for echoes that should not exist. Most reported nothing beyond ambient ward hum. A few reported headaches, nausea, a sense of pressure behind the eyes. Those reports were filed and dismissed as exposure fatigue. One psyker, a woman whose name I never learned, requested immediate reassignment after a single shift. Her report contained no specifics, just a single sentence, repeated 3 times in slightly different wording. It is not asleep. The report was sealed. She was transferred. Her name vanished from the roster the following cycle. After that, no one volunteered additional commentary. The custodians increased their presence shortly thereafter, though no official notice accompanied the change. Patrol overlaps tightened. Thresholds that had once been monitored remotely now required physical confirmation. Their movements were precise, economical, and unmistakably deliberate. They did not react to threats. They anticipated them. It was during this period that I first noticed the auditory irregularities. They were not sounds in conventional sense. No voices, no knocks, no scratching behind adamantium. It was more like the absence of expected sound. A corridor that should have echoed did not. Footsteps that arrived muted, as if absorbed by something just beyond perception. The effect never persisted long enough to trigger alerts, but lingered long enough to unsettle. I reported it once, carefully, using approved language. The response came back sterile and immediate. Ambient variance within tolerance. No further action required. The message beneath the words was clear. Do not pursue this. That night cycle. During a route reassignment that took me past a junction I had never previously walked, I passed a vault face marked with no designation at all. No denial glyphs. No inquisitorial seal. Just black adamantium uninterrupted by symbol or scripture. It felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. The other doors were warnings. This one was an omission. I did not stop. I did not look directly at it. I did not need to. The sensation followed me anyway. A pressure behind the sternum. Not fear exactly, but attention. The awareness of being adjacent to something that did not need to announce itself to be significant. I recited my calibration litany under my breath until the feeling faded. Later, reviewing the route logs, I noticed that junction did not appear in a recorded path. The system showed a clean traversal from one corridor to the next, no deviation. Either I had misremembered, or the record had been corrected. I understood then what the black vaults truly were. They were not merely containers. They were filters. They filtered information, memory, interpretation. They ensured that even those tasked with guarding the Imperium's most dangerous secrets could never assemble enough context to fear them properly. Fear requires shape. Shape requires knowledge. Down here, knowledge was atomized until it could no longer cohere. That was the true lock, and it was working. Because despite everything, the cold, the silence, the sense of proximity to something vast and restrained, I continued my patrols. I logged my routes. I recited the litanies. I accepted the absence of explanation as a form of safety. The Imperium did not trust us to understand what was hidden beneath the throne. It trusted us to endure not knowing. And as long as that endurance held, the black vaults would remain closed. Not because nothing within them stirred, but because nothing outside was allowed to ask why. The first time you understand why the Imperium builds vaults instead of graves, it does not come as a lesson. It arrives as a correction. Corrections are quiet things in the palace. They do not announce themselves with sirens or executions. They appear as altered procedures, revised litanies, new ward cycles added to schedules that were already full. A seal that once required 3 confirmations now requires 4. A patrol route shortens by 20 meters without explanation. A vault face that had been serviced weekly is suddenly placed under daily observation. No reason is given. None is needed. The Imperium does not explain what it fears. It demonstrates how seriously it takes that fear. I learned this while updating a redundancy matrix that had not changed in recorded history. The task itself was ceremonial, reconfirming layers of authorization that no longer had living signatories. Names of long-dead Inquisitors, Mechanicus archmagi, and custodians whose genetic lines have been recycled back into the throne's silent vigilance. My role was not to understand the Matrix, only to ensure that its structure remained intact. That day, one entry refused to resolve. It was not flagged as corrupted, not redacted, simply unresolved, as if the system itself hesitated. The designation field remained blank, while the authorization layers beneath it confirmed clean. I ran the check again. Same result. A pause, then a neutral confirmation tone. The absence felt deliberate. Protocol demanded escalation. I followed it exactly, transmitting the anomaly upward without commentary. The response came back faster than any I had ever received. Immediate reclassification. Matrix sealed. Access revoked retroactively. I was instructed to undergo recalibration and reassignment review. No reprimand. No warning. Just removal from proximity. That was when it began to make sense. Some things are not destroyed because destruction is an interaction. It requires contact, energy transfer, consequence. The Imperium understands consequence better than any civilization in history. It has learned, painfully and repeatedly, that certain threats do not diminish when confronted. They react, they adapt, they leave echoes. The black vaults exist to avoid interaction. Fragments of information circulated among those of us who maintained the framework long enough to notice patterns. Not facts, not details, just shapes, a relic that cannot be disassembled without destabilizing surroundings. An entity whose destruction would release a resonance in the warp that cannot be predicted. A truth so foundational that exposed it would fracture doctrine faster than any rebellion ever could. These were not rumors in the conventional sense. No one spoke of them aloud. They manifested as procedural anomalies, as over-engineered containment for something that should have required far less. Excess effort is always suspicious. One vault, buried beneath 3 separate authorization strata, require continuous null-field reinforcement despite no recorded psychic activity. The explanation offered was preventative redundancy, but redundancy implies known risk. This was something else. A refusal to assume safety even in the absence of evidence. Another vault demanded ritual reinforcement by 3 separate faith traditions, Mechanicus rite, ecclesiarchy litany, and custodian silence, performed in sequence. No official justification existed for the overlap. The implication was unspoken but clear. Whatever lay within did not belong entirely to any one framework of understanding. The Imperium does not fear the unknown. It fears the partially known. Xenos can be studied, classified, exterminated. Demons can be banished, their patterns cataloged across millennia. Even heresy follows predictable shapes. But there are threats that exist in the interstices, things that break rules without replacing them, entities that resist categorization not through power, but through implication. Destroying such things risks confirming what they represent. It is safer to lock them away, deny them context, and let ignorance act as insulation. This philosophy permeates the vault architecture itself. The deeper you descend, the less descriptive the records become. Early vaults carry extensive annotation. Origin unknown, function hypothesized, threat potential moderate to extreme. Deeper ones offer only location codes and maintenance schedules. The deepest carry nothing but time stamps and confirmation seals. Silence, formalized. The most telling evidence of this approach lies in what the vaults do not contain. They are not full of enemies defeated in glorious campaigns. Those are displayed, studied, or destroyed. The Black Vault's house failures. Mistakes that could not be undone. Victories that cost too much. Discoveries that revealed answers no one was prepared to live with. I once overheard a custodian speak to a Muggos during a threshold inspection. It was not meant for me, but proximity makes some things unavoidable. The custodian's voice was calm, almost reflective. Some victories, he said, leave the battlefield intact, but damage the future. The Muggos did not reply. He did not need to. That sentence stayed with me longer than any whispered horror ever could, because it explained everything. The Black Vaults are not built because the Imperium is weak. They are built because the Imperium understands that some threats grow stronger when ended. Some truths reshape reality simply by being resolved. In those cases, permanence is not achieved through destruction, but through denial of closure. To lock something away is to deny it resolution. And resolution, I was beginning to understand, is far more dangerous than fear. Once you accept that the Imperium prefers containment to annihilation, the logic begins to surface everywhere. It is woven into architecture, doctrine, even prayer. Destruction is decisive, but it is also loud. It leaves evidence. It invites questions. Containment, by contrast, is quiet. It allows a problem to exist without acknowledging its implications. And implication, more than any physical threat, is what the Imperium truly fears. Down in the Vault Strata, this philosophy expressed itself through excess caution bordering on reverence. Not worship, never that, but a careful, almost reluctant respect. Servers assigned to certain corridors were lobotomized beyond standard parameters, stripped not just of memory, but of pattern recognition capability. They could perform tasks flawlessly while remaining incapable of noticing repetition or anomaly. The Mechanicus logged this as efficiency optimization. Those of us who watched them work understood the real reason. Nothing that passed those vault faces was allowed to observe too closely. Even the custodians treated some thresholds differently. Their stance never changed, but their presence lingered longer. Patrol routes tightened. Authorization tokens were verified twice, then verified again by a second custodian who had not witnessed the first exchange. When questioned, carefully, always carefully, the response was the same. Redundancy preserves reality. No elaboration followed. The few hints that slipped through came not from official briefings, but from failure reports scrubbed too slowly. A ward collapse corrected before alarms triggered. A localized warp fluctuation dampened, so efficiently that the surrounding systems barely registered it. In one instance, an entire maintenance cycle was erased from the archive, replaced with a single confirmation seal dated 3 days later. Whatever had occurred during those missing hours was deemed less dangerous forgotten than recorded. It became clear that the Imperium was not merely containing objects or entities. It was containing outcomes. Some vaults, I realized, did not exist to prevent escape. They existed to prevent conclusion. Inside them were things whose destruction would answer questions no one wanted answered. Weapons whose activation would prove doctrines incomplete. Entities whose death would create martyrs in the warp, or destabilize regions that had been stable for millennia. Knowledge whose confirmation would fracture the ideological scaffolding, holding the Imperium upright. The Black Vaults were not emergency measures. They were architectural admissions of uncertainty. This was most evident in the way classification worked. The deeper vaults had no descriptive identifiers because description itself was considered a form of engagement. Naming something creates a relationship. Recording its properties implies intent to act on that information. By refusing to describe, the Imperium denied itself temptation. Ignorance was not a failure of intelligence here. It was policy. There were whispers, of course. Not stories. Stories invite imagination, but structural rumors. Vaults whose maintenance schedules had never changed in 10,000 years. Seals whose authorization keys were hard-coded into gene lines no longer extant. Chambers built with expansion tolerances, as if designed to accommodate growth rather than confinement. None of this was confirmed. None of it needed to be. What mattered was a pattern. Everything dangerous enough to be placed in the Black Vaults shared one trait. It could not be interacted with safely, even in destruction. Its end would be an event, not a resolution. An event's ripple. I began to understand why the Imperium destroys worlds without hesitation, but hesitates before certain objects small enough to fit behind a single door. A planet's death is tragic, but comprehensible. Its consequences are finite. A singular anomaly, left unresolved, might rewrite cause and effect itself. The Imperium can survive loss. It cannot survive reinterpretation. That truth revealed itself fully during a rare cross-order inspection. An Inquisitor of the Ordo Malleus arrived unannounced, accompanied by Mechanicus savants and escorted by 2 custodians whose presence alone collapsed the corridor's atmosphere into something heavy and final. The inspection passed without incident. No seals were breached. No records were accessed. As they departed, I overheard the Inquisitor speak, her voice low and precise. "We do not guard these things because they are alive," she said. "We guard them because they are correct." The meaning struck me harder than any threat could have. Correctness implies inevitability. A thing that is correct will assert itself if given the opportunity. It does not need to escape. It only needs to be acknowledged. The black vaults exist to deny acknowledgement indefinitely. That night, I revised my understanding of what lay beneath the throne. These were not cages built in fear. They were pauses imposed on reality. Deliberate delays placed on conclusions the Imperium was not prepared to face. The horrors within were not always monstrous. Some were elegant, some were simple, some were merely true. And truth in the Imperium is the most unholy terror of all. The damage does not announce itself immediately. That is the most dangerous thing about it. Those assigned to Black Vault duty do not break in obvious ways. There are no sudden psychotic episodes, no dramatic refusals of duty, no open heresies shouted into the lumen-lit corridors. The Imperium would know how to deal with that. Instead, the cost accumulates quietly, distributed across months and years until it becomes difficult to remember what normal once felt like. It begins with sleep. Dreams grow shallow, then fragmented, then sparse. Not nightmares, those who imply content, but a thinning of rest itself. Personnel wake feeling as though they have been conscious all night without remembering being awake. Medici assessments show no abnormalities. Cortisol levels stabilize. Neural scans return clean. The only change is subjective, and subjective data is always the first thing dismissed. After sleep comes memory. Not loss exactly, more like misplacement. A patrol route recalled slightly out of order. A calibration phrase remembered with perfect accuracy, but no emotional association. Faces remain recognizable, but names slide away unless actively reinforced. Administratum scribes begin annotating their own slates with reminders for tasks they performed for decades without error. This is logged as occupational fatigue. Rotation schedules are adjusted, nutrient blends modified, litanies recalibrated. The system responds as it always does, with optimization rather than inquiry. The Imperium is very good at maintaining function without examining cause. For most, that is enough. For a minority, it is not. These individuals do not exhibit instability in the way doctrine defines it. They become, instead, intensely precise, overly attentive to procedure. They double-check seals that do not require it. They recite litanies under their breath, even when not scheduled. They begin to speak less, not out of fear, but because language starts to feel imprecise. Words imply shape. Shape invites speculation. Speculation is dangerous. The Mechanicus refers to this as hypercompliance, a desirable adaptation. A worker who adheres too strictly to protocol cannot deviate accidentally. Requests for reassignment from such individuals are denied as a matter of policy. They are performing optimally. I watched one such adept, a man who had served beneath the palace for longer than most people lived, gradually erase himself through correctness. His armor was always immaculate, his logs immaculate, his speech reduced to acknowledgments and confirmations. When he finally stopped speaking entirely, no one intervened. Silence is not a symptom in Imperial doctrine. He continued his duties without error until the day he did not arrive for shift. Search protocols were initiated and terminated within the hour. His quarters were sealed, his records archived, his name removed from the active roster, replacement assigned. There was no inquiry into what he might have seen or thought. That line of questioning was irrelevant. The system does not investigate compliance. Others deteriorate differently. Sanctioned psychers assigned to vault-adjacent duty rarely last beyond a handful of cycles. Even with strict exposure limits, something in the lower strata exerts pressure that does not manifest as psychic assault. It is more like proximity to unresolved intention. They report a sense of anticipation that never resolves, a conclusions perpetually delayed. The human mind is not built to sit near pause narratives. Most are reassigned quietly. A few are retired permanently. The Scutarii endure longer, but not without cost. Their augmetics filter sensory input, but they also record. Over time, memory loops appear in their logs, brief segments replayed without external trigger. The Mechanicus corrects these as data corruption, purging redundant segments to preserve efficiency. No one asks why the corruption always occurs near the same vault strata. Even the custodian guard is not untouched. They do not speak of it, of course. They never would, but their patrol patterns tighten around certain vaults. Their pauses lengthen by fractions a second that only another custodian would notice. They stand as if listening, not with ears, but with something older and quieter. Whatever lies behind those doors does not threaten them directly. That makes it more dangerous, not less. For those of us in between, neither gene-forged demigods nor lobotomized servitors, the cost is cumulative. You learn to compartmentalize aggressively. Thoughts are sorted before being allowed to form fully. Curiosity is intercepted and redirected toward maintenance minutiae. You cultivate an internal discipline so rigid it begins to resemble devotion. Not faith in the emperor, not belief in doctrine, but faith in procedure itself. Procedure becomes morality. Follow the steps. Maintain the seals. Do not interpret. Do not imagine. Do not ask what would happen if something ended rather than remained. Because endings are what the vaults exist to prevent. The greatest strain is not fear. It is restraint. The human mind is designed to resolve tension, to seek conclusions. Down here, tension is preserved deliberately. You exist in permanent proximity to unfinished things, and that proximity changes you. I began to notice in myself only when I took leave above ground. The palace felt too loud, too open. Conversations moved too quickly. Conclusions reached too easily. People spoke opinions as if they were harmless. I found myself instinctively scanning rooms for exits, listening for pauses and sound that might indicate something unsaid. The absence of containment felt unsafe. That was when I understood the true cost of guarding the unholy. The vaults do not merely hold threats. They teach those who guard them how to think like a prison. And once that lesson settles, it does not stay below the throne. The longer you remain assigned to the black vaults, the more difficult it becomes to remember a version of yourself that existed before them. Not because that self is erased, but because it no longer feels relevant. The person you were above ground belonged to a world that believed problems could be addressed, resolved, concluded. Down here, that belief feels naive. What replaces it is not despair, but adjustment. You stop expecting relief. You stop waiting for explanations. The absence of answers becomes a stable condition rather than a failure state. This adaptation is subtle enough that most do not recognize it as damage. In fact, it often presents as improvement. Reaction time sharpens. Emotional variance narrows. Thought patterns align more closely with procedural logic. From the Imperium's perspective, this is success. From a human perspective, it is something else entirely. Relationships begin to atrophy. Personnel still speak, still exchange acknowledgments, still perform required social rituals. But conversation loses texture. Humor fades first. Jokes rely on shared assumptions, and assumptions are dangerous near the vaults. Then curiosity goes. Questions linger unanswered too often to remain appealing. What remains is exchange stripped to function. When someone is reassigned or disappears from the roster, there is no grief. Grief requires narrative, an understanding of why someone mattered, how their absence changes the story. Down here, the story is static. Loss registers as a scheduling adjustment. This is not cruelty. It is containment logic applied inward. I began to notice that my own thoughts followed similar pathways. When anomalies appeared in reports, my response was not concern, but relief when they were classified beyond my clearance. Not knowing felt safer than understanding. That realization disturbed me far more than any vault irregularity ever had, because it meant the system was working. The Imperium does not rely on terror to secure compliance in the black vaults. It relies on normalization. Over time, Proximity to the unresolvable reshapes your definition of what stability looks like. Stability becomes synonymous with postponement. If nothing changes, nothing escalates. If nothing escalates, nothing demands decision. Decision is the true danger. I witnessed this principle tested only once. A junior logistics officer, new, well-trained, earnest in a way only the recently indoctrinated can be, noticed a pattern in maintenance intervals that had not been corrected by the routing cogitators. It was minor, a timing discrepancy of seconds across multiple cycles. But patterns invite interpretation, and interpretation invites hypothesis. He brought it forward, carefully, citing procedure rather than intuition. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not punitive, protective. His access was restricted, his duties reassigned. A recalibration, review scheduled before the end of the cycle. By the time I saw him again, his demeanor had changed, not frightened, corrected. The question had been removed, and with it, the impulse to ask others like it. He thanked me, quietly, for listening. I did not ask what he meant. That was when I understood the final function of the Black Vaults. They do not merely contain external threats or suppress dangerous knowledge. They cultivate a culture where resolution itself is suspect, where the safest outcome is indefinite delay, where questions are not forbidden, but rendered unnecessary. The Imperium does not need to silence everyone. It only needs to teach them that silence is efficient. Above ground, wars rage. Sectors burn. Heroes rise and fall. The Imperium presents itself as an empire of decisive violence, of righteous purges and uncompromising faith. That image is real but incomplete. Beneath it exists another Imperium, one built not on action, but on restraint so disciplined it becomes invisible. The Black Vaults are the purest expression of that restraint. They are monuments to problems the Imperium refuses to solve, not out of weakness, but because solving them would force change. And change, in an empire this vast, is more dangerous than any contained horror. When my reassignment finally came, it was unceremonious. A simple update to my routing slate. New duties, new strata, no explanation, no debrief. I was not relieved so much as displaced, slid sideways out of system that had decided I was no longer optimally shaped for it. As I ascended, level by level, sound returned, smell returned, color returned. The palace above felt almost chaotic in its openness. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt exposed, because part of me was still down there, pacing corridors that refused to explain themselves, guarding doors that were never meant to be opened, maintaining pauses the galaxy could not afford to end. The cost of guarding the Unholy is not madness. It is adaptation so complete that the world beyond containment begins to feel unstable. And once that happens, the Black Vaults no longer need to hold you. You carry them with you. The Imperium insists, officially and absolutely, that the Black Vaults are inert, secure, silent. Whatever is sealed within them is contained so completely that interaction is no longer possible. This position is repeated across doctrinal briefs, inquisitorial risk assessments, and Mechanicus containment models with unwavering consistency. Unofficially, no one who works near the vaults believes this. Silence, after all, is not the same as absence. Anyone who has stood long enough in a sealed corridor learns the difference. Silence has texture. It has pressure. It gathers around thought and waits to see what shape that thought will take. The deeper vaults are not loud places. They do not intrude. They do not announce themselves. If anything, they are defined by restraint so deliberate it borders on intention. The first signs are never dramatic. They cannot be, or they would trigger doctrine-written responses. Instead, they manifest as coincidence, as alignment, as moments when systems that should be independent of one another behave as if they are listening to the same unheard signal. A maintenance cycle shortens itself without instruction. A ward write concludes a fraction of a second early, yet remains stable. Two separate scribes, working from different strata, make the same transcription error on the same designation without ever comparing notes. Each incident is isolated, correctable, dismissible. Together, they form a pattern that no one is authorized to acknowledge. Those closest to the vaults learn to feel these moments before they can be measured, a sensation of anticipation during routines that have not changed in centuries, the impression that a corridor is not empty, but waiting, not occupied, never that, but attentive in a way a hell breath is attentive. Sanctioned psychers experience this most acutely, which is why their exposure is so tightly controlled. Their reports, when allowed to persist at all, avoid descriptive language. They do not speak of voices or visions. They speak of alignment, of thoughts that feel encouraged rather than implanted, of conclusions that arrive fully formed without any sense of having been reasoned toward. One report, circulated briefly before classification sealed it, described the sensation as being agreed with. That phrasing was enough to end the discussion. The Imperium does not recognize communication unless it conforms to known models. Warp entities speak through possession, manifestation, corruption. Xenos influence through pheromones, mimetics, or direct psychic intrusion. The things held in the black vaults do neither. They do not persuade. They do not threaten. They do not request. They resonate. This is why official doctrine insists the vaults do not whisper. Whispering implies sound, language, intent. Resonance is harder to classify. It suggests that something need only exist to exert influence. That proximity alone is sufficient. And proximity, in the deepest vault strata, is unavoidable. I never heard anything I could call a voice. What I experienced, what many experienced, though none of us said so aloud, was a gradual narrowing of thought around certain ideas. Not obsessions, not commands, just a recurring sense that some questions were more relevant than others, even when doctrine insisted otherwise. The idea that containment was not merely precaution, but preference. The idea that some outcomes were being delayed not because they were dangerous, but because they were correct too soon. These thoughts did not feel alien. That was the most unsettling part. They felt compatible. Like puzzle pieces that fit too easily into existing beliefs about the Imperium's nature. They did not contradict doctrine. They refined it, suggested efficiencies, offered interpretations that required no rebellion, no defiance, only patience. It is here that the line between containment and dialogue begins to blur, not because the vaults speak, but because they do not need to. A thing that is perfectly still exerts influence by forcing everything around it to move. A truth that is never stated shapes every decision made to avoid it. The black vaults are full of such truths, ideas, entities, conclusions, locked away not to silence them, but to prevent the galaxy from reaching them prematurely. This is why breaches are not the Imperium's greatest fear. Recognition is. An acknowledged anomaly must be addressed. An addressed anomaly must be understood. And understanding leads inevitably to choice. The Imperium can survive war, rebellion, even heresy. What it cannot survive easily is being forced to decide between two correct but incompatible futures. The vaults exist to delay that decision. And yet, delay is not the same as prevention. Every century, the strain increases. Wards must be reinforced more frequently. Custodian patrols linger longer at certain thresholds. Inquisitorial oversight grows heavier, not because of new evidence, but because absence itself begins to feel insufficient. The systems designed to ignore implication are under pressure from the simple fact that something has been waiting a very long time. The vaults do not whisper loudly. They do not need to. They wait for alignment, of minds, of doctrine, of circumstance, until the difference between containment and acceptance becomes so small that no one remembers when the boundary shifted. And when that happens, the Imperium will not hear a breach alarm. It will hear agreement. Once the idea takes root that the black vaults do not need to speak in order to influence, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee, not because it grows louder, but because it grows consistent. The Imperium prides itself on consistency. Doctrine, ritual, and hierarchy are designed to produce the same outcomes across wildly different contexts. When something begins to align too well with that machinery, it stops registering as foreign. That is how the whispering works. It does not arrive as temptation. It arrives as agreement with conclusions already reached. A custodian extends a patrol by a few heartbeats longer than usual, not because he is instructed to, but because it feels correct. A Muggos recalibrates a ward sequence in a way that deviates slightly from established right, yet improves stability. An Inquisitor delays a recommendation for destruction, not out of doubt, but because the timing feels premature. Each action is justified. Each decision is defensible. Taken alone, none suggests interference. Taken together, they form a system that is no longer merely maintaining containment, but optimizing it. This is where the danger lies. Containment is meant to be static. It is supposed to preserve a problem in a fixed state, unchanged and unchanging. Optimization implies adaptation. Adaptation implies feedback. And feedback, no matter how subtle, is a form of communication. The Imperium insists that no such loop exists. Officially, every adjustment is attributed to human judgment, algorithmic refinement, or divine guidance. No one suggests that the vaults themselves are participating. That idea is dismissed not because it is terrifying, but because it is unnecessary. The outcomes are desirable. Stability improves. Breach probability decreases. The system works better. Why question success? I saw this logic crystallized during a doctrinal symposium convened beneath sealed clearance. I was present only as a records conduit, a silent observer meant to log conclusions without context. Inquisitors, magi, and representatives of the Custodian Guard debated the long-term viability of indefinite containment. The language was precise, bloodless. Terms like temporal deferment and ideological load management replaced more direct phrasing. At no point did anyone ask whether the things inside the vaults were changing. The assumption was universal. They did not need to, because change, as the Imperium understands it, requires action, movement, expression. What lies within the black vaults exhibits none of these. It does not escape. It does not attack. It does not even degrade in measurable ways. By all observable metrics, it is inert, and yet the systems around it continue to evolve. Wards grow more sophisticated. Authorization hierarchies deepen. Entire branches of doctrine are revised subtly to accommodate permanent uncertainty. The Imperium becomes better at postponement, better at living beside unresolved truths without acknowledging them. The vaults, without doing anything at all, have reshaped Imperial behavior. That is influence without intent, or perhaps influence so complete that intent no longer needs to be expressed. There are those within the Inquisition who sense this danger and try to articulate it, though never directly. They speak instead of containment dependency, of the risk that the Imperium's identity becomes entangled with the very horrors it refuses to confront. If the vaults were ever emptied, not through breach, but through obsolescence, the resulting vacuum would destabilize more than any threat ever could. What would the Imperium be without its pauses? This question is never voiced in full. It does not need to be. Its presence is felt in the tightening of security protocols, in the expansion of the vault network beyond Terra to other secure worlds, in the quiet decision to build new prisons for threats that have not yet been discovered. The Imperium is no longer reacting to danger. It is anticipating the need to defer. In this way, the Black Vaults have become doctrine. They teach the Imperium that not every problem should be solved, that not every truth should be revealed, that some endings must be delayed indefinitely for the sake of continuity. This lesson is absorbed so thoroughly that it no longer feels imposed. It feels obvious, natural, and that is the final whisper, not a command, not a promise, a philosophy. The vaults do not ask to be opened. They do not threaten escape. They simply exist as proof that the Imperium survives by refusing resolution. Over time, that refusal hardens into identity. The Imperium becomes an empire defined not by what it conquers or destroys, but by what it refuses to conclude. Somewhere beneath the throne, behind doors without names, something remains perfectly still, not because it is powerless, but because stillness is sufficient. It has learned that the Imperium will do the work for it, reinforcing walls, rewriting doctrine, reshaping itself around an absence it has decided never to fill. When the vaults whisper back, they do not say anything at all. They wait for the Imperium to finish the sentence for them. The final truth about the Black Vaults is not hidden behind adamantium or buried beneath kilometers of stone. It is visible in policy, in habit, in the way the Imperium responds when confronted with something it cannot categorize cleanly. The vaults endure not because the horrors within are eternal, but because the Imperium has decided that emptiness would be worse. A vault that can be closed implies the possibility of opening it again. A vault that can be emptied implies resolution, and resolution forces a reckoning. Every object destroyed, every entity annihilated, every truth finally addressed creates consequences that must be integrated into doctrine, history, and belief. The Imperium is capable of many things, but integration is not one of its strengths. It survives through accumulation, not synthesis. The Black Vaults represent an alternative strategy. They allow the Imperium to acknowledge danger without incorporating it, to recognize a problem without adapting to its implications. The vaults are compromises made permanent, solutions that do not resolve. And because they do not resolve, they do not end. This becomes clear when one studies the vaults not as physical structures, but as institutional commitments. Each vault requires generations of maintenance. Each seal binds entire orders into perpetual vigilance. Each unresolved containment creates a lineage of guardians, scribes, ward keepers, and overseers whose purpose is defined by preservation rather than progress. The vaults do not merely hold terrors. They generate roles, careers, identities, entire bureaucratic ecologies built around the assumption that nothing inside will ever be allowed to conclude. Once such systems exist, dismantling them becomes unthinkable. To empty a vault would mean admitting that centuries of restraint were temporary, that vigilance was not a permanent necessity, but a holding pattern. It would mean asking whether the fear that justified the vault's existence still applies, and whether those who devoted their lives to guarding it did so in service of something that no longer mattered. The Imperium does not ask such questions. Instead, it expands. New vaults are constructed quietly, often justified by precedent rather than immediate threat. A relic deemed anomalous enough to resist classification is not destroyed, but earmarked for potential containment. A warp phenomenon whose long-term implications cannot be modeled is scheduled for observation rather than intervention. Over time, the vault network grows not because threats increase, but because tolerance for uncertainty decreases. The Imperium is not becoming safer. It is becoming more cautious. This distinction matters. Safety implies a reduction of danger. Caution implies the management of fear. The Black Vaults do not eliminate risk. They redistribute across time, deferring confrontation indefinitely. This strategy works, until it does not. Every vault represents a delayed decision. Every delay compounds. The Imperium has survived 10,000 years by postponing conclusions, but postponement is not infinite. Eventually, the weight of unresolved truths begins to shape the structure meant to contain them. This is why the vaults will never be empty. Not because opening them would unleash catastrophe, though some surely would, but because emptiness itself would destabilize a narrative the Imperium relies upon. An empty vault is a solved problem. A solved problem demands reinterpretation, and reinterpretation is the enemy of dogma. Better than to maintain the pause, better preserve the threat in perfect stillness, ensuring that no one ever has to decide what comes after containment. The vaults become proof that some things are too dangerous not because of what they do, but because of what their resolution would require. Change. The Imperium has learned to fear change more than any demon, xenos, or heresy. Change implies vulnerability. It implies adaptation. It implies that the current form of the Imperium is not final, not perfect, not eternal. The Black Vaults deny that implication. They stand as monuments to the idea that survival is achieved by refusing to conclude. That permanence is built not through victory, but through suspension. That the safest answer to some questions is to never answer them at all. And so the vaults remain sealed, not waiting for a breach, not waiting for release, waiting for nothing. They are not failures of courage or faith. They are expressions of an empire that understands itself too well to risk self-examination. As long as the Black Vaults exist, the Imperium can continue without confronting the limits of its own philosophy. That is why they will never be empty. Because emptiness would mean the Imperium had finally decided. Decision is the one thing the Imperium is structured to avoid. It presents itself as absolute, uncompromising, eternally certain. Yet beneath that certainty lies a system engineered to defer reckoning whenever reckoning threatens continuity. The black vaults are the purest expression of that instinct. They are not temporary solutions waiting for a future age strong enough to face them. They are acknowledgments that such an age may never come, and that this is preferable, because an empty vault would demand explanation. If a horror is destroyed, someone must record how. If a truth is disproven, doctrine must adapt. If an entity is resolved rather than contained, its absence creates space where questions can form. The Imperium survives by ensuring that space never appears. The black vaults occupy preemptively, filling uncertainty with structure, ritual, and silence. Those who believe the vaults exist solely to protect the Imperium misunderstand their deeper function. They protect the Imperium from self-awareness. Within the Administratum, entire branches exist whose sole purpose is to maintain the continuity of containment records, not to analyze them, not to evaluate relevance, simply to ensure that every vault remains part of an unbroken chain of obligation stretching backward to the heresy and beyond. If something has always been contained, it must continue to be contained. Longevity becomes justification. In this way, fear fossilizes into infrastructure. The Imperium no longer remembers why certain vaults were sealed in the first place. It remembers only that they were sealed by authorities whose judgment cannot be questioned without destabilizing the legitimacy of all authority that followed. To open a vault would not merely risk what lies inside. It would imply that the Imperium is capable of revising its past decisions. That implication is intolerable. So the vaults remain closed generation after generation, tended by those who are trained not to ask what they guard. The horrors within are preserved not as active threats, but as conceptual anchors, proof that some things are beyond resolution, and that postponement is wisdom. This creates a paradox the Imperium refuses to examine. By refusing to resolve its greatest dangers, the Imperium ensures they remain part of its future, not as invasions or apocalypses, but as permanent absences shaping behavior from the shadows. The Black Vaults influence policy without issuing orders. They shape doctrine without rewriting scripture. They exert gravity simply by existing. In time, this gravity changes what the Imperium considers normal. New generations grow up accepting that some truths are never meant to surface. That silence is not ignorance, but virtue. That stability is achieved not by confronting danger, but by surrounding it with enough ritual that it stops feeling immediate. The Black Vaults teach this lesson better than any sermon ever could. They also teach something else, far more dangerous. They teach that containment is easier than understanding. As long as that lesson holds, the Imperium will continue to build vaults faster than it empties them. Every unresolved anomaly becomes a candidate for preservation. Every inconvenient truth becomes something to be sealed rather than integrated. Over time, the number of things the Imperium refuses to confront grows large enough to define it. At that point, the vaults are no longer exceptions. They are the rule. Somewhere beneath the throne, behind doors without symbols and corridors designed to erase memory, lies a collection of pauses so vast that even the Imperium has forgotten how many there are. Each one represents a moment where certainty would have been dangerous, where closure would have demanded change. The Imperium chose endurance instead. That choice has kept it alive for 10,000 years. It may also be the reason it can never truly move forward. The Black Vaults will never be empty because emptiness would force the Imperium to acknowledge that survival through postponement has limits. That eventually, the cost of refusing resolution outweighs the fear of confronting it. Until that day comes, the vaults remain sealed, not as prisons, not as failures, but as monuments to an empire that understands one truth above all others. Not every horror needs to escape to shape the galaxy. Some only need to be locked away long enough to become permanent.